This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom, where you can pre-order every card from Phyrexia All Will Be One right now using my referral link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nissa, and today I'm continuing with my Phyrexia All Will Be One limited set review. So far, I've looked at all the non-mono green cards in the set, and today we're finishing up with a look at those mono green cards. While this marks the end of the card-by-card portion of my review, there's still a lot more Phyrexia All Will Be One limited content on the way, including an archetype guide, my picks for the format's biggest bombs, draft videos that will start later this week, and format updates. So, if you want to stay aware of all of that, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Anyway, I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards, and if you don't know what those letter grades mean, check out the description where you can find an explanation. Before we take a look at the first card, a few reminders. This review is about limited. That means draft and sealed. That means I'm only going to be reviewing cards that appear in draft boosters. Also, keep in mind that these are my feelings about these cards before actually playing the format. That means I'm definitely not going to be perfect here. After all, every format is different. Lastly, I want to let you know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review, in other words, later today, you'll have access to a spreadsheet with all of my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's take a look at our first green card, which is Adaptive Spore Singer, which for 2 generic and a green is a 2/2 Phyrexian Druid at common. It's got Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose one. Target creature gets +2/+2 and gains Vigilance until end of turn, or Proliferate, which means you choose any number of permanents and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. Both of these triggers have their place. +2/+2 in Vigilance is a boost that can really allow you to have a much better turn, since it can allow a creature to attack more effectively and stay on defense. And when Proliferate is useful, it can be really useful and really augment your board with oil counters or give your opponent another poison counter. This looks like a nice common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Armored Scrap Gorger, which for 1 generic and a green is a 0/3 Phyrexian Beast at uncommon. It gets +3/+0 as long as it has 3 or more oil counters on it. It can tap to add 1 mana of any color, and when it becomes tapped, you exile target card from a graveyard and put an oil counter on Armored Scrap Gorger. This looks pretty good. It fixes and ramps your mana effectively, and actually can become a 3/3 in the later stages of the game, and that's enough size to at least be relevant all game long. It's also incidental graveyard hate, and while graveyards aren't a huge theme in the format, they do come up some. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Bloated Contaminator, which for 2 generic and a green is a 4/4 Phyrexian Beast at rare. It's got Trample and Toxic 1. If a creature has Toxic, when that creature does combat damage to a player, they get poison counters equal to the Toxic value, in this case, 1. And if you get 10 poison counters, you lose. When it deals combat damage to a player, you Proliferate. So this has a great stat line, it comes with evasion, and Proliferate and Toxic both synergize really well with the set, not to mention one another. It probably falls a little short of being a bomb, as it doesn't dominate the game when it comes to the later stages, but it's pretty darn good. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Branch Blight Stalker, which for 1 generic and a green is a 3/1 Phyrexian Elf Scout at common, and it's got Toxic 2. A 2-mana 3/1 with upside will usually make the cut in aggro decks, but it isn't anything special. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Canker Bloom, which for 1 generic and a green is a 3/2 Phyrexian Fungus at uncommon. You can pay 1 and sacrifice it and choose one, destroy target enchantment, or destroy target artifact, or Proliferate. This has great stats and a great modal ability that will pretty much always do something meaningful. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Carnivorous Canopy, which for 2 generic and a green is a common sorcery. It says destroy target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. If that permanent's mana value was 3 or less, Proliferate. There are a decent number of artifacts and enchantments in this set, so it isn't a disaster to run this, especially because it has Proliferate upside. But it is a bit of a bummer that all the artifact spot removal in the set is a little worse in a world with the Mirrodin mechanic, because your opponent still holds on to a token, and this being a sorcery is pretty rough too. I think this is mostly a sideboard card. I think it almost reaches the point where you don't feel actively bad to have it in your deck, but I can't really imagine that many situations where I'm happy that this made the cut, so I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Conduit of Worlds, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a rare artifact. You can play lands from your graveyard, and you can tap it and choose target non-land permanent card in your graveyard. If you haven't cast a spell this turn, you may cast that card. If you do, you can't cast additional spells this turn. Activate only as a sorcery. The first sentence on this card usually isn't that great in Limited, but one thing to keep in mind is there are several common lands in the format that put themselves into the graveyard. There's the Sphere Cycle and Terramorphic Expanse, so playing those from your graveyard will actually feel pretty good. Casting things from your graveyard is where this gets really great though, even with the downside of it making it so you can't cast other spells that turn. It does feel like it'll be pretty bad to have this in the early and mid game when you need to develop your board, but in the later stages of the game, it has the potential to take over. You can't really blank on draws if your graveyard is effectively part of your hand, and that's what this is going to feel like. So yeah, I mean, this is powerful, but it really isn't very good until the later stages of the game. And in the early game, playing it will probably mostly be a liability, so I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Contagious Vorak, which for 2 generic and a green is a 3/3 Phyrexian boar beast. At common, when it enters the battlefield, you look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a land card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If you didn't put a card into your hand this way, proliferate. This is a great common. If this could only proliferate when it entered or only get a land from the top 4, it would be a good common. So having the option between both of these is great. It can help you hit your land drop when that's what you need, and then you can proliferate in the later game when your opponent needs to get another poison counter or you need more oil counters. I'm giving this a B-. Next up, it's Copper Longlegs, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/3 Phyrexian spider at common with reach, and you can pay 1 generic and a green and sacrifice it to proliferate. A 2-mana 1/3 with reach just isn't very good these days. This can give itself up to proliferate, which is alright, since it will often not be a very relevant body on the board. Still, it doesn't feel like a card that's going to make the cut consistently, giving it a D+. Next up, it's Evolved Spinoderm, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 5/5 Phyrexian beast at rare. It enters with 4 oil counters on it. It has Trample, as long as it has 2 or fewer oil counters on it. Otherwise, it has Hexproof. At the beginning of your upkeep, remove an oil counter from Evolved Spinoderm. Then if it has no oil counters on it, sacrifice it. This is a fun callback to Blastoderm, and it carries on that legacy pretty impressively. A 4-mana 5/5 Hexproof is still great today, and while I wish it could hold on to Hexproof forever, the fact that it trades it in for Trample definitely softens that blow, and means it becomes more of a problem as an attacker after it's lost those first 2 counters. Obviously, its time on this earth is limited, but having a 5/5 Hexproof around for 2 turns and a 5/5 Trampler for the other 2 turns is really going to swing games in your favor pretty often, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Evolving Adaptive, which for 1 green mana is a 0/0 Phyrexian warrior at uncommon. It enters the battlefield with an oil counter. It gets +1/+1 for each oil counter on it, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, if that creature has greater power or toughness than Evolving Adaptive, put an oil counter on Evolving Adaptive. This is a callback to Experiment 1, and it looks pretty sweet. If you play it early, it's going to get massive, and it is a 1-drop that can potentially take the game over. It does get worse the later you play it, but it's still likely to grow basically anytime you play a creature, and obviously it works with Proliferate too. This is a great uncommon, giving it a B. Next up, it's Expand the Sphere, which for 3 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. It says look at the top 6 cards of your library, put up to 2 land cards from among them onto the battlefield tapped, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If you put fewer than 2 lands onto the battlefield this way, proliferate a number of times equal to the difference. This has a cool design. You have a pretty good chance of hitting 2 lands when you cast this, and that is some pretty serious ramp. But I love that you can choose some combinations of lands and proliferating when you cast it. Sometimes in the late game, drawing your ramp spell isn't what you want, and this becomes a 4-mana sorcery that proliferates twice, and that's often going to have some impact on your board. It isn't great at actually fixing your mana since you only get to look at the top 6, but yeah, I love the modality here as both options have their moments, but I'm also concerned that this format's going to be too fast, in which case this card does get significantly worse because you're paying 4, and probably not having a huge impact on the board when you do it. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Green Sun's Twilight, which for X and a green is a rare sorcery. It says reveal the top X+1 cards of your library, choose a creature card and or a land card from among them, put those cards into your hand and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. If X is 5 or more, instead put the chosen cards onto the battlefield or into your hand, and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So I think you'll have to pay 3 for X to get you 2 cards consistently. Paying less than that for X is going to be a little sketchy. So this is, in the earlier part of the game, a more expensive green divination, which isn't great. After all, it won't really add to the board at all. But if you can get 5 for X, you're likely to get a land and a creature onto the battlefield, and at that point we are talking about a card that impacts the board immediately. If this was only a 6-mana card that looked at your top 6 and put a creature and a land on the battlefield, that would probably be pretty close to a B. There will be times where you don't get 6 mana's worth of value out of it, but most of the time you'll do alright. It is a little awkward that the more mana you spend on this, the less likely you're going to get a good return on your investment, so I don't love that, but still, the fact that this is pretty nice on 6 and it does something in the early game makes it a pretty good card. I'm giving it a B. Next, it's Spit Basilisk, which for 2 generic and a green is a 1/3 Phyrexian Basilisk. At common, it's got Death Touch and Toxic 1. A 3-mana 1/3 Death Touch is not the most impressive thing ever, but it does provide an okay roadblock against aggressive decks. Adding Toxic to a Death Toucher is nice too, since blocking this can be a real pain, and then if you take it, you have to get a poison counter, which could be bad news for you. Still, not a great card. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Incubation Sack, which for 1 green mana is an uncommon artifact. It enters with 3 oil counters. You can pay 4 and tap it, and remove an oil counter to create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token, activate only as a sorcery. This has the potential to be really good in Limited, especially because it has the ability to make 3 bodies. Now, it certainly isn't efficient at making those bodies, but in a lot of Limited formats, cards that simply let you outcard the opponent are what you need, and this can definitely do it. A 3-for-1 really isn't out of the question here, and that's not something you find at lower rarities all that often. It reminds me a little bit of Mask of the Jadecrafter from the Brothers' War, which turned out to be a pretty good card. It also feels like it will actually do a solid job of putting a stop to an aggressive start, since starting on turn 4 you can crank out a 3/3 every turn that can probably trade for their stuff, and you don't have to use up more than 1 card to do it. So I'm reasonably high on this card. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Infectious Bite, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon instant. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. Each opponent gets a poison counter. Instant Speed Rapid Bite is already good, so tacking on a poison counter is pretty nice. As always, you have to be a little careful about casting this type of removal, but it will do the job really well most of the time. Giving it a B. Next up, it's Latticeblade Mantis, which for 3 generic and a green is a 4/3 Phyrexian insect at common. It enters with 2 oil counters. When it attacks, you remove an oil counter from it if you want to. If you do, you untap it and it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. This looks like a nice common. A 4-mana 4/3 is almost passable, so adding the ability to use oil counters to buff it up to a 5/4 that untaps is quite nice. This can hit pretty hard while playing both offense and defense. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Maze's Mantle, which for 2 generic and a green is a common enchantment aura. It has flash, it has enchant creature, and when it enters the battlefield, if enchanted creature has toxic, that creature gains hexproof until end of turn. Enchanted creature gets +2/+2. A 3-mana flash aura that gives +2/+2 is a card we've seen before, and it was reasonably playable. If you look at this only as a combat trick, it doesn't seem that efficient, as you can usually get a lot more than +2/+2 for a 3-mana trick. However, this does stay around to enhance that creature beyond that turn, and the hexproof upside is going to come up a reasonable chunk of the time in your green decks. This is another nice trick in this format. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Nissa Ascended Animist, which for 3 generic, 2 green, and 2 green Phyrexian mana is a legendary planeswalker Nissa and Mythic Rare. She starts with 7 loyalty, and she has Completed. Now, Nissa is a little different than the other completed cards because she has 2 Phyrexian symbols in her casting cost, so for each one of those that you pay 2 life for, she enters with 2 fewer loyalty. She has a +1 that creates an XX green Phyrexian horror creature token, where X is Nissa Ascended Animist's loyalty. She has a -1 that says destroy target artifact or enchantment, and she has a -7 that says until end of turn, creatures you control get +1/+1 for each forest you control and gain trample. This is a bomb basically no matter when you cast it, and the modality is pretty big upside. She can come down and generate a huge token right away, and that token will do a great job of protecting her. Even if you play her with 3 loyalty, that token will usually be a problem for your opponent. Note, by the way, that the token is locked in its size when it gets created. It doesn't have text on it that adjusts her power and toughness like some effects. So even if Nissa dies, the token will stick around. Anyway, her -1 will have plenty of targets in the format, and her -7 will be a huge overrun effect. If you pay the full 7 for her, which can be a little tricky because that would be 4 green mana, but if you can do it, she can even use her ultimate right away, which has a good chance of just winning you the game on the spot. So no matter when you decide to cast her, she will be a token factory that can remove plenty of permanents that also just threatens to win the game the moment she gets to her ultimate. I'm giving her an A. Next up, it's Noxious Assault, which for 3 generic and 2 green is an uncommon sorcery. Creatures you control get +2/+2 until end of turn. Whenever a creature blocks this turn, its controller gets a poison counter. This is kind of a cool take on a mass pump effect. There will be times when this puts your opponents in a lose-lose situation, since they can neither take all the damage or get the poison counters, but I feel like most of the time they will be able to find a way to mix and match and survive. 5 mana for this sorcery speed boost is just normally not a very good card in limited. It's highly situational and very clunky, and I don't quite feel like the poison counter upside is enough for me to want to play this. It's definitely hard to evaluate as the poison versus damage choice can be powerful, but I think this will probably be too situational to be very good, giving it a D. Next up, it is Oil Gorger Troll, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 3/4 Phyrexian Troll Warrior at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 life. Then, if you control a permanent with an oil counter on it, draw a card. So, a 5 mana 3/4 that draws you a card and gains you 3 life when it enters the battlefield every time, all the time, would probably be a B. Like, that would be a really good card. But that's not what this will always be. Sometimes it's only going to gain you the 3 life. But green does have enough access to oil counters, especially if you pair it with red, that drawing the card off of this isn't impossible. I mean, I would think you're probably going to be able to pull it off like half the time. And it is nice that you get this 3 life still in situations where you can't meet the oil counter trigger. So I think it looks like a pretty good common. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it is Paladin of Predatory, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a 6/7 Phyrexian Knight at uncommon. It has Toxic 6, and it can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. So this is hard to chump block, and it can end the game in 2 swings thanks to Toxic, and there's a good chance that hitting your opponent once with it will win you the game. If you're in green, your opponent probably has 3 or 4 poison counters by the time you're casting your 7 mana spell. The stat line isn't amazing for the cost, and there will still be enough boards where your opponent can just double block it and take it down. It also doesn't deliver any bonus value you get to hold on to in the event it gets destroyed, and usually if I'm spending 7 mana in limited these days, I should get something, whether it's life or a creature token or something else. I need to get something in the event that things go really wrong here, because if I don't, there's a good chance I lose. So this ends up being a really swingy card where your opponent will either die to it or be able to destroy it for like 2 mana and completely out-tempo you. So I think it's probably a C. Next up, it's Plague Nurse, which for 3 generic and a green is a 3/4 Phyrexian Cleric at common with Toxic 2. Each other creature you control with Toxic gains Toxic 1 until end of turn, activate only once each turn. A 4 mana 3/4 with Toxic 2 is fine, and adding more Toxic to your Toxic creatures can definitely cause problems. The threat of activation is something that your opponent really has to consider on a board where you have a few other Toxic creatures. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Predation Steward, which for 1 generic and a green is a 2/2 Phyrexian Elf Warrior at common. It enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters, and you can pay 2 generic and a green and tap it and remove an oil counter to give target creature +2/+2 until end of turn. Activate only as a sorcery. This seems like a solid 2-drop. The ability isn't exactly efficient, and it is definitely clunky as a sorcery speed only effect, but it can certainly allow you to send in an attacker that you couldn't attack otherwise, and it also allows you to get some oil counters on your board in the early part of the game, so some of your cards that check for those will be turned on. I'm giving this a C. Next up, it's Rustvine Cultivator, which for 1 green is a 1/2 Phyrexian Elf Druid at common. You can tap it and put an oil counter on it, and you can tap it and remove an oil counter from it and untap target land. I don't think this looks very good. The best thing about a Mana Dork is that it can play you more powerful spells every turn, and This doesn't do that. It will finally untap a land on turn 3, and while the boost is nice, the fact that you have to tap this twice to get there is no small thing, and then you have to do it all over again if you want to ramp again later. Obviously, if you add Proliferate to the mix, you can get some more oil counters on it, so it's not quite as slow. But I think you're jumping through hoops for a 1-drop that just isn't that good anyway. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Ruthless Predation, which for 1 generic and a green is a common sorcery. Target creature you control gets +1/+2 until end of turn. It fights target creature you don't control. So this is basically Epic Confrontation, which is always a great limited common. +1/+2 enables a lot more of your creatures to fight successfully than would be able to otherwise, and you can often knock a blocker out of the way and swing in with your buffed creature. Again, like with most green removal spells that involve targeting your own creature, you have to be a little careful about when you use it so you don't get 2 for 1, but it's still a B-. Next up, it is Skyscythe Golfer, which for 5 generic and a green is a 6/5 Phyrexian beast at common. It's got reach and trample, and it can't be blocked by creatures with flying. This offers you a pretty real body for 6 mana. If you're behind, it can hang back and block even flyers, and if you're ahead, it can attack pretty hard. Again, this is another expensive card where I wish I got some amount of value in the situations where things go wrong, but you just don't get that. It also doesn't have any particular synergy with anything going on in the set, which I think hurts its value as well. I think it's a C-. Next up, it is Sylvok Battle Chair, which for 4 generic and 2 green is an uncommon artifact equipment with 4 Mirrodin. This means when it enters the battlefield, you make a 2/2 red rebel creature token and attach this to it. Equipped creature gets +4/+4 and has trample, and it can equip for 5 generic and 2 green. This is Colossal Dreadmaw with upside, since it starts out as a 6 mana, 6/6 trampler. The equip cost is a lot, but once you reach a point where you can just slap this on whatever you want, your opponent is going to be in serious trouble because every creature you have can become a threat, and if you cast a Battle Chair in the first place, you're not that far away from having the mana to move it around. So up front, you get a reasonably efficient 6 mana creature, and, I'm complaining about these 6 and 7 mana cards that don't leave value behind when things go wrong. This does. If your opponent can blow up the equipment, you still have a 2/2, and if they can blow up the creature, you still have the equipment. So I think this looks really nice overall as a top curve card for green decks, giving it a B-. Next up, it's Thirsting Roots, which for 1 green is a common sorcery. It says choose one, search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle, or proliferate. This is a solid modal card. It can help you fix your mana or just hit a land drop, and it's the kind of card that can almost stand in for a land in your deck, since it's almost a modal double-faced land. Once you have the lands you need, you can proliferate, which might give you some value. There are times when neither mode is particularly useful, which is a bit of a bummer, but most of the time you'll be getting something worthwhile for your small investment. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Thrun, Breaker of Silence, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 5/5 legendary troll shaman at rare. He can't be countered, he's got trample, he can't be the target of non-green spells your opponents control or abilities from non-green sources your opponents control, and as long as it's your turn, Thrun is indestructible. This new Thrun looks great. You could take away any of his individual abilities and he would still be amazing. He's incredibly difficult to deal with, as only opposing green cards can target him, and on your turn he also happens to be indestructible, which really matters for a 5/5 trampler. It will be a great attacker on most boards as a result, since it's pretty much a free attack. Thrun's efficiency and resilience make him a bomb, giving him an A. Next up, it's Titanic Growth, which for 1 generic and a green is a common instant. Target creature gets +4/+4 until end of turn. +4/+4 will win you a lot of combats, and 2 mana isn't a terrible amount to spend for the boost. It can also sneak in lethal out of nowhere better than a lot of tricks can. This is another solid trick in a set filled with them. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it is Tyrannak's Atrocity, which for 3 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 Phyrexian dinosaur at common. It's got haste and Toxic 3. Toxic 3 is a lot. It will immediately give you Corrupted if you don't already have it, and if you do already have it, 3 poison is going to get your opponent in the red zone in many situations. Toxic pairs really well with haste too, as it makes it easier to get in that first time, or at the very least set up a situation where your opponent's options are a bad chump block or taking the hit. I'm giving this a C+. Next, it's Tyrannosaurus Rex, which for 4 generic and 3 green is an 8/8 Phyrexian dinosaur at Mythic rare. It can't be countered, it has Trample, it has Ward 4, it has Haste, and it has Toxic 4. So this is some impressive efficiency. It can come down and do something right away, thanks to Haste. Ward also means that this can't be dealt with very efficiently, and Toxic and Trample go really well together. If your opponent takes any damage at all from this, even 1 trample damage, Your opponent still gets the full 4 poison, and obviously you destroy their creature too. Triple green can be surprisingly hard to get in limited sometimes, but I still think this does enough right away and is hard enough to deal with that it gets into the lower bomb range. Really, it's just being an expensive card that keeps it from having an even higher grade, giving it an A-. Next up, it is Tyvar's Stand, which for an X and a green is an uncommon instant. It says target creature you control gets +X/+X and gains hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. Paying 2 total for this means you get +1/+1 hexproof and indestructible for 2 mana. We've seen tricks like that before, and those have always been pretty nice. They allow you to help your creature win combat, and they allow you to blank removal spells, so it has flexibility. And this has the upside of both scaling as the game goes on, and being castable for only 1 green when that mode is useful for you, which is often going to be the case when your opponent tries to kill your creature with a removal spell. So, in a lot of ways, this set has a lot of great tricks in it. This one's probably just the best. It has broad situations where it's useful. It's going to produce blowouts. It can allow you to sneak lethal in out of nowhere. It basically does everything that a trick can do, and it does it really well. So I think it's a C+. That doesn't sound like an amazing grade, but for a trick, that's pretty high. It's still situational, even though it's flexible for a trick. Lots of situations where this just doesn't do enough. You already have to have a board of some sort, for example. There are lots of situations where it doesn't help as much as just drawing a creature would, but it's really good. I don't see myself ever cutting the first of these from my green decks, and you'll probably play the first 2 really happily. Next up, it's Unnatural Restoration, which for 1 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. Return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand, proliferate. We see this effect a lot, and a regrowth that only gets permanents is not usually great in limited, especially if that's all the card does. This isn't terrible, but it can be underwhelming for a lot of reasons. For one thing, it doesn't do anything unless there's a permanent in the graveyard, and it doesn't really feel like you're accomplishing something unless there is a really nice permanent in your graveyard, so it can be a dead card for a while. Usually, this type of card is like a D+. I do think the proliferate upside is enough to push it a little higher. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Venerated Rot Priest, which for 1 green is a 1/2 Phyrexian Druid. At rare, it's got Toxic 1. And whenever a creature you control becomes a target of a spell, target opponent gets a poison counter. A 1-mana 1/2 with Toxic 1 can get some poison going if you play it on turn 1. After that, this card does become less relevant, but it is nice that when you play this, your opponent one way or another is likely to get 1 poison counter no matter what, since if they remove the priest, they get a poison counter, and if you have a bunch of creatures with toxic, it will feel particularly good when they have to kill one of them and leave the priest alone. Note, by the way, that casting a trick on your own creature also gives your opponent a poison counter, so you can produce poison counters either by your creatures getting removed or by casting tricks on your creatures, and we've already seen green has some nice ones. All that said, this is probably still just a C. It won't do something super meaningful most of the time, whether you play it early or in the mid to late game. Next up, it's Venomous Brutalizer, which for 2 generic and 2 green is a 4/4 Phyrexian Knight at uncommon. It's got Toxic 3, and when it enters the battlefield, you can pay 1 generic and a green, and if you do, proliferate. This looks really good. It gives you a good rate, and Toxic 3 is pretty legit, as is the fact that you can kick this to proliferate, something that will have a real impact by that stage of the game more often than not. I'm giving this a B. Next up, it's Viral Spawning, which for 2 generic and a green is an uncommon sorcery. It creates a 3/3 green Phyrexian Beast creature token with Toxic 1, and it has Corrupted, which means this card gets better if your opponent has 3 or more poison counters, and in this case, it gains Flashback while it's in the graveyard, obviously, for 2 generic and a green. This is a great uncommon, and it may be green's best. You'd already play a 3-mana 3/3 with Toxic 1. That's probably right around a C at worst, but the flashback upside here is huge because it gives the card a very accessible 2-for-1 potential, and the 2 bodies you get are pretty real, and I think most of the time you'll find a way to get that second beast, especially because the first one can help you get there. I'm giving this a B+. Next, it's our last card, which is Zopandrel Hunger Dominus, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a 4/6 legendary Phyrexian horror. At Mythic Rare, it's got Reach. At the beginning of each combat, double the power and toughness of each creature you control until end of turn, and you can pay 2 green Phyrexian mana and sacrifice 2 other creatures to put an indestructible counter on it. 7 mana is a lot, but most of the time when you play this, it's probably just going to win you the game. The turn you play it, it's likely to have a big impact on the board, provided you have any creatures in play at all. There's a good chance they will be able to attack even if they couldn't before, and if they already could, they'll now attack for a ton. If somehow you couldn't attack, this also works reasonably well on defense as it offers the buff every combat. including during your opponent's turn. It's also nice that this can become indestructible even when you're tapped out, though awkwardly. Giving up 2 creatures makes Zapandrel's ability less powerful. Of course, it can attack on its own at that point as an indestructible 8/12, which is pretty sweet. This costs 7, but it impacts the board immediately in a big way, and it's resilient. I think that makes it a bomb. I'm giving it an A-. So, those are my thoughts on all the green cards. In Phyrexia, all will be 1. Tomorrow, I'll be back with the format's archetype guide. And as I said at the beginning of the video, there's a whole lot of other content coming too, so don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you're caught up on this set review, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.